Hello, and welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. So, generally speaking, most people would consider me to be on the left politically. In fact, to hopefully make my podcast more interesting, and because I find it practical, I often try to view topics through sort of an anarchic lens, critical of power, critical of authority, the state, religion, etc. So you might be surprised that in some key ways I can actually respect tradition. And actually, sometimes I think we would be far too lost without it, or at least without certain traditions. That's right, I actually do not believe all traditions should be abolished, that we need to totally start over from square one, or even that everything is completely and totally wrong. Although, of course, you could say that there's a little bit of wrong and a little bit of right in most things. You could generalize like that. I get that vibe, and there's the yin and yang aspect of philosophy that sometimes portrays life in general in that way. So I believe we should question some things, even get rid of some things, but not everything. And here I will elaborate a little bit more on what I mean. I'm not going to get too specific. This is more about just general truth. So every generation inherits something that's sort of invisible. I'm not talking about wealth, buildings, or technology, but knowledge, that's often associated with the construction of all of those things. The accumulated experience of countless people who lived before us, lessons about how to survive, how to cooperate, how to raise children, how to celebrate, how to mourn, and ultimately how to build a civilization. This desire to pass knowledge from one generation to the next is the engine of cultural evolution. Without it, every generation would be forced to begin again from scratch, and that would be a little bit messy. And that transmission is remarkably fragile. The transmission of knowledge and experience. History reminds us that civilizations don't simply lose buildings or governments, they can lose memories, they can lose skills, they can lose traditions that once defined who they were. So today I'm exploring why traditions emerge, why some disappear, and why preserving our cultural inheritance may matter more than some people realize. Because civilization is a chain of memory. Every society depends upon a continuous chain of teaching. Parents teach children, masters teach apprentices, communities teach newcomers, and the chain stretches backward for thousands of years. Well, really, since time began, basically, in some way, since there have been human beings. Yet throughout history, that chain has broken many times. You have war, economic collapse, disease, natural disasters, political upheaval, whatever you care to name that's just quite disruptive. Whenever societies face existential threats or prolonged instability, the careful work of teaching becomes secondary to immediate survival. So complex crafts disappear, languages might fade, religious rituals vanish, traditional knowledge is forgotten, and what once took centuries to accumulate can disappear with only a few generations. Even without complete collapse, periods of instability often simplify culture. Customs that required time, resources, and specialized knowledge become difficult to maintain. People naturally focus on whatever is most immediately useful. And that's one of the reasons why traditions change. Of course, not every disappearing tradition represents a tragedy. Many traditions existed because they solved practical problems in the world that people once inhabited. Societies were more local, travel was slow, communication was limited, communities remained relatively stable across generations. Under those conditions, customs weren't simply symbolic, they often served practical functions. And today, technology has replaced many of these functions. Letters have become emails and text messages more often than not. Family recipes compete with online tutorials. Community gatherings increasingly happen through digital networks instead of physical meeting places. So, as our world changes, many traditions naturally become less necessary, and that's simply cultural evolution. That's not to say there isn't something nice about receiving a letter in the mail if it's from somebody you care about. There's something a little bit nostalgic about that. It shows that they took some time to write that letter down, write those words down with their own hand, with pencil or pen, and there's something to that. But it's not something that's as necessary as it once was. The challenge is recognizing the difference between traditions that have merely outlived their usefulness and traditions that continue to provide benefits we no longer immediately recognize. So, another thing I have to mention here, of course, is that tradition is not automatically good. Now, that's sort of a no duh thing, at least for me, but for some people, it's just, something they don't even think about that often. They assume that, well, my own view is the correct one because it's the traditional one. It's what my parents believed, therefore it must be right. It's what their parents believed, what previous generations thought was the immutable truth. Well, sometimes those truths actually turn out to be not so true after all. It's important to avoid romanticizing the past too much. Not every tradition deserves preservation. History contains customs that promoted injustice, inequality, discrimination, and unnecessary suffering. And, of course, that continues into today's world. And there's a lot of unnecessary suffering rooted in certain belief systems. And many societies have wisely abandoned certain practices over time. And of course, in some cases, we're pushing against certain practices in today's world. Age alone doesn't make an idea true, and of course, it doesn't make it totally untrue or totally bad either. Just because something has always been done one way, or apparently has always been done way, or done one way, doesn't mean it should continue forever. Tradition should never become an excuse to avoid moral progress. The real question isn't whether something is old, the question is whether it still serves human flourishing. Yet traditions that survive across centuries often do so for a reason. They sometimes represent accumulated experimentation that produced some positive results. There can be wisdom hidden inside traditions. Countless generations encountered similar problems and gradually developed customs that helped communities function. Some traditions preserved or practical knowledge, others preserve moral expectations, still others preserve identity itself. They're, less like museum exhibits and more like cultural operating systems. They often extend into the present. And we often don't notice what we're doing until they're gone, And that's not to say that some of these things that we think are important won't go away someday, but you know, sometimes they actually should stick around. And what about identity? Sometimes identity can seem like a bad thing, like people are too obsessed with it. And I would agree that often people are too obsessed with identity and even with the idea of preserving culture. Sometimes you just have to accept that things naturally change over time, and not every cultural shift is going to be the end of the world. But one of tradition's greatest gifts is answering a simple but profound question: who are you? Not merely as an individual, but as part of something larger. Where do you come from? What stories shaped your family? What holidays do you celebrate? What songs do you sing? And all that kind of stuff. So, as much as I might depict myself as somebody who's not traditional or not traditional obsessed, I still, I'm from the rock era when it comes to music. So that is actually, in some way, as much as it sounds corny to me, a sort of traditional view that I actually have. I still listen to a lot of rock music, and it's my favorite genre overall. And, that's me kind of celebrating a tradition in a way. So, another question is, what values do your grandparents hope you'll carry forward? And, you know, unfortunately, when it comes to my own background and the Finnish language, I barely speak a word of Finnish, even though I'm a Finnish American. So, that's an example of, I guess, my grandparents and my parents kind of failing to teach me the language that had its links to my family history. I barely know any Finnish words. That's just the way it is. And I kind of regret that I didn't learn any words like that. And that's something that technically is lost, at least to me individually. It was a lost opportunity. So, even though, like I said, I'm not a particularly tradition oriented person, I can still see that and feel like there's something a little bit missing there. And even if I did take Finnish lessons, tomorrow, it would still be different from if I had learned a different language when I was younger. It doesn't have to be Finnish, it could be any language. Uh, it's different to learn a language when you're in your 40s from learning it when you're a kid. You're gonna have a better history of learning that language if you've experienced it at a younger age and persistently used it throughout your life. And such connections give people a sense of belonging that extends beyond their own lifetime. Without them, many people experience a growing sense of rootlessness. And, that can be a cause of possible distress, even a lack of social cohesion. Shared traditions also strengthen trust at times, so communities function more smoothly when people share at least some common expectations, whether it's celebrating holidays, helping neighbors, honoring elders, or participating in some community rituals. Shared customs remind people that they are members of the same story. So the sociologist Emil Durkheim argued that societies are held together not merely by laws, but by shared beliefs and collective values. And that sounds simple enough as a theory. I abide by that premise. And traditions help reinforce those invisible bonds. They create what modern researchers might describe as social cohesion, the mutual trust and respect that allow communities to cooperate even during difficult times. And boy, does it seem like we do have some difficult times. And what about moral frameworks? Many traditional values have survived because they consistently produce stable relationships. And those are the kind of moral frameworks and traditional values that I am quicker to defend. Things like just meat and potato stuff like honesty, responsibility, compassion, loyalty, keeping one's word. Those aren't merely old-fashioned ideals, they're practical tools for building trust. And those are actually part of a traditional understanding of how society is supposed to function. So, in that broad sense, I think tradition can be great. I also like the basic premise of a justice system that is rooted in having evidence for when somebody makes an accusation against another person. And it's not just about me. If another person is accused of doing some horrible deed, I want that person to be able to defend themselves against that claim, and I want evidence to matter and that sort of thing. And that's an important type of trust as well. And Every civilization discovers sooner or later that societies become difficult to sustain if promises mean nothing, if families disintegrate completely, or if trust disappears. So technology may change, human nature changes more slowly, and lessons are sometimes learned the hard way because tradition also traditions also preserve experience. Long before scientific journals existed, societies recorded successful solutions through stories, rituals, and customs. So, not everything is about, the scientific understanding of things. Customs and just the existence of, uh, stable homes, all of those things matter. If you do have things that disrupt people, like economic problems, of course natural disasters like I mentioned, it's hard to have a functioning society. Some traditions seem strange today because we have forgotten the problems they originally solved. Others still contain practical wisdom hiding beneath some symbolic language. So discarding every inherited practice simply because it appears outdated, it can risk throwing away knowledge that required centuries to accumulate. And sometimes we should accumulate knowledge of what sort of knowledge we had accumulated in the past. Learning about what we learned is actually a worthwhile pursuit. Sometimes people only rediscover the value of something after it's already been lost, and there are only traces of it left. So this becomes especially important after things like disasters. Corinne Wedgener, I believe that's how her name is pronounced. But anyway, she's a cultural heritage preservation officer at the Smithsonian Institution. She once observed that you have a golden hour to save cultural heritage just as you do human life. And her point wasn't that artifacts matter more than people, quite the opposite. It was that cultural heritage and people cannot easily be separated, and they're both, equally as important. So when communities lose their historical memory, they often lose part of their identity as well. So saving books, photographs, sacred sites, languages, songs, traditional crafts, those aren't just luxuries, they actually help communities remember who they are while rebuilding some of what they've inevitably lost over time. And every group risks losing some things, and even if you're the best scrapbooker out there, is it the case that somebody else is going to go through your scrapbook and sort of relive your own history? Probably not. So there needs to be a collective effort to maintain, the past. And of course certain things will be lost, and it's it's always a little bit interesting to consider what will remain and what will just be put in the scrap heap. And what is the future of tradition? I guess that's another interesting question. Some today worry about new kinds of disruption like rapid technological change, artificial intelligence or AI, climate pressures, geopolitical instability, nuclear weapons. That's reemerging again as a significant issue that we keep on hearing about in the news. So, whether or not these concerns are equally justified, they still raise an important question. Could modern civilization lose not only infrastructure, but also cultural memory? The danger isn't simply losing information. Digital archives can store a lot of information pretty much indefinitely. So I think the real danger is losing the habit of passing wisdom from one generation to the next. Knowledge only survives when people continue to value it and sometimes seek it out. So you can technically preserve something nowadays, but it might just be preserved in empty space with nobody actually there to view it. And then, it's sort of like that riddle of, if a tree falls and there's no one around to hear it, does it still make a sound? You know, Technically you could say, yeah, it does make a sound, but if there's no one there, it practically doesn't matter. And the same is true of tradition. So tradition is neither sacred nor not obsolete, and some traditions deserve to disappear, like I said. Others deserve careful preservation. I would say, even the bad traditions we still need to learn about. The bad ideas in history, we should learn from them and learn not to repeat them. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people just have not learned the lessons from the past. Like World War II was not really that ancient of a history. It was, you know, within some people's lifetimes, really. Um, and I think as history doesn't repeat, but it echoes itself, I think we really drop the ball when it comes to learning from the past and preventing future tragedies. And, when it comes to traditions that deserve to go away and those that deserve to be preserved, wisdom lies in distinguishing between the two. Every generation inherits both mistakes and achievements. Our responsibility isn't just to preserve everything unchanged, nor to discard everything old in the name of progress. It's to examine what we have inherited with some humility, to improve what needs improvement, and sometimes to abandon what causes harm, and to preserve the hard earned wisdom that still helps human beings live meaningful and connected lives. Because civilization is more than buildings, governments, or technology, it's a conversation across generations. And every one of us has the opportunity and the responsibility to decide what part of that conversation we pass on.